Good morning, and welcome to day 2 of the National Press Foundation's Living Longer, the New Age for Aging Fellowship. We have had an extraordinary first day of conversations, of information shared about the 55 plus age demographic of workers. And if I had to sort of call the top 2 things we drew from yesterday's conversations, the first would be that we cannot think of this demographic in a sort of a monolithic way. There are at least two conversations to have about the people who are continuing to work, the reasons why they're doing it, the supports that they need to continue to work and to be productive. And the other thread would be that, contrary to our training as journalists, we're so often sent out into the field to find the tension, to find what's wrong. And certainly when it comes to this demographic, it would be far too easy to perhaps focus on all of the challenges and the barriers to continuing to do meaningful work. But what we've learned from yesterday's conversations, from the data, from the thought that we received from our speakers, is that there are certainly more opportunities than challenges in many ways for the older worker demographic. And we as journalists truly have a responsibility to try to seek out those stories and to interpret them correctly. So this morning we're going to pivot and we're going to explore some of the contextual elements that feature in this conversation. We're going to be talking about the intergenerational workforce. And again, another opportunity to either focus on dissension and barriers versus cooperation. We're going to talk about intersectionality and all of the layers of challenges for people of color and other aspects of the demographic. And we'll also later get into a very thorough discussion of artificial intelligence and what it means. But for right now, we are going to focus on the intergenerational workforce. And I have had an extraordinarily positive time interviewing and working with and identifying the speakers for this panel. And they include Jean Accius, who is the Senior Vice President for Thought Leadership at AARP. They include one of my new best friends, Ruth Finkelstein, the Executive Director of the Brookdale Center for Healthy Aging. And they include Jacqueline M. Baker. She's a leadership consultant and author of the new book just released called The Unexpected Leader. And you also own a company called Scarlet, is that correct? I may have to just jump in and take the reins from you, Jean, at that point, because I really want Jacqueline to connect us to this issue of the younger end of the generational scale and what it takes to be successful. So Jean has very graciously agreed to moderate this panel and to take over from me. So please take it away.
There's a lot of things that's happened in the last 2.5 years. So I'm going to just set the stage, and then you're going to hear from our amazing panelists. One is the fact that COVID has drastically changed the workforce and the workplace. We, in many cases, thought that we were going home for a week or maybe 2, and it turned out to be 2.5 years. We were forced to sit with ourselves and really contemplate exactly who we are, what do we want to do, and what's the meaning of life, among other different types of questions. We've also seen over the last 2 years what I'm referring to as the drivers of the Great Migration. How many greats have you heard? The Great Resignation, the Great Reset, the Great Reshuffle, the Great Reprioritization. There's just a great. Now we're shifting from the great to the quiet. Quiet quitting. Right? But throughout all of this, there's this war on talent that's happening. Right? How do we retain, attract top talent? So this is, you might know her as Beyonce. I think that she has come out with a song that is probably the rallying cry for so many people. And in part, there's some that I actually bolded. I'm not going to use some of the terms, but during your break and during your next activity as a cohort, put it on YouTube. But you work me so blank hard. Work by 9, then off past 5. I'm looking for motivation, and in some cases, I'm building my own foundation. Regardless of the situation, you will not break my soul. So the question is, who's the you is she referring to? And what is this rallying cry that we're actually seeing? Like I said before, there's been headlines from the Business Times, work sucks when you're the only one left. CNBC said, how quiet quitting became the next phase of the Great Resignation. And now because of the great inflation, you're seeing a return in the marketplace. And then you hear, well, not necessarily so quiet quitting, but quietly returning, right? So there's a lot of shifts that's happening actually in the labor force. At AARP, we've actually done some work on this, looking at the Great Resignation. We've been tracking data since January of last year, particularly for those over the age of 50. And what we found was the fact that particularly this most recent wave is actually between July 18th and mid-August of 3,000 people. So this is actually recent data that we're sharing with all of you. You get a sneak peek before it actually becomes public later today. And when we've talked about what were the top reasons people retired, left, or considered leaving their job, aside from being close to retirement age for this population, low pay and being felt undervalued was a key number. Lack of advancement or professional development. The work that I was doing no longer provided me with a sense of meaning, this idea of purpose. So what we're seeing here is the fact that over the last 2 years, when we've had to force ourselves to kind of confront the things that we wanted to do in life, we've had to make some reprioritizations that you actually see take place in the marketplace. So when you say, okay, well, when you're changing jobs, what are you looking for? Well, as you can imagine, better pay, more opportunity for growth, greater flexibility, better benefits, more in line with my passions. But we also know that age discrimination is actually real. And that age discrimination, you will see in a second, stifles economic growth across the continuum of age. So this right here just shows you that, particularly in July of 22, that nearly 62% of respondents said that older workers face discrimination in the workplace based on their age. And that 93% said that age discrimination against older workers is so common in the workplace today. It also costs us when we discriminate against people based off their age. This study finds that it actually stifles economic growth, $850 billion in 2018. And if we do absolutely nothing, it'll be about $3.9 trillion by 2050. But we know that not only is the fact that the population is aging, but people are living much longer. And yes, you might be a millennial today, but you'll be joining the 50-plus cohort relatively soon, and we'll be right here waiting for you at AARP. The economic contributions of people over the age of 50 is real. In 2018, it was about $8.3 trillion worth of economic activity. And then by 2050, it'll be $28.2 trillion. Again, taking into account the different cohorts. Why am I sharing this? It's because of the fact that we have to connect the workforce, the workplace, with the marketplace. And understanding your marketplace also helps to drive strategy in the workplace as well as the workforce. 5 generations side by side. That is the new normal, particularly in our workplace. We've done some research surveying over 6,000 C-suite executives from all of the OECD countries and found that 83% of executives value a multi-generational workforce. They value it. Yet 53% don't include age in their diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. So we're going to get into that. How do we close the gap? So why invest in an age-diverse workforce? We know there's greater productivity. There's greater retention and continuity. That there's greater performance across an age-diverse team. And then, of course, there's more information sharing. So now I have the great pleasure, I hope you are all buckled up, because this was just context. And I'm just going to do my job as a moderator and listen and take great notes from these two amazing speakers. So will you please join me in recognizing Ruth and Jacqueline to the stage here.
Wash my water.
So I am really excited about this conversation and to hear from both of you. And I want to start off the conversation with really just a general question. As I indicated earlier, we've had this period of time where people have spent some intentional, or maybe it wasn't intentional, but they had to grapple with some very deep questions. And from your perspective and from your vantage point, how has the pandemic impacted worker attitudes and worker behaviors? And can you say a little bit about this tension, if you will, potential tension, between what workers want and what employers expect?
Sure.
Yeah.
First of all, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with each and every one of you. I'll speak personally for a second and say that I am certainly a part of a cohort of people who was impacted by COVID. And I think that everyone's hands would raise if I asked who here either personally or through a family member was impacted by COVID over the past couple of years. And because of that, so many workers and even us personally, we have started to recognize our relationship to mortality. Right? We started to realize like, oh, we actually aren't going to be here forever. And we already knew that, but COVID just made it a lot more real. And so when we start to recognize our relationship with mortality and the fact that, oh, our end here could be quicker than what we thought it would be, we start to question the things we're involved in, the relationships that we have, and even our commitment to our workplace. And so for so many people, for so many years, they were under this guise of maybe even fear at a workplace, maybe just trying to make ends meet. And then something greater came along, which is our relationship with no longer being here. And it starts to impact our decisions around, do I want to commit to this place anymore? This commute that I have every day, does this make sense for me? You start to question so many things. And so for me, for the work that I do across the country, in the leadership space, I have these intimate conversations with people around their daily commitments and how they see their work every day. And it impacts their relationships with their employers and the decisions that they make every day around what they expect from their employers as well. And so that truly is what I've seen. That is what people have shared with me. And I think that that just impacts how people see the relationship with their day-to-day job and their day-to-day work.
So in preparing to come and talk to you guys today, I was thinking about the research that I've done with employers about multi-generational workforce, particularly about making work for older workers and with older workers. And I started comparing that with the research that we've been seeing about the workforce during COVID. And I was struck by the fact that, oh, everybody's older workers now. The values that older workers who have the privilege of choosing whether to work. I want to be very clear that right this minute, I'm talking about older workers who have some choice in the matter. I will later want to talk a lot about workers who don't have choice in the matter, because we really are talking about two different situations. And I remember where I am, but let me embed one other point. Could I see a show of hands of everybody here who works because they need to work? Now can I see a show of hands of everybody who works because they want to work? Lucky us, right? So I say that to say that when we make this stark dichotomy between old people who work because they need to and old people who work because they want to. It's not so stark. There's a mix. There's always a mix. But anyway, when we're talking about people who have some choice in how engaged they're going to be with the paid workforce, the things that pull them in to the paid workforce are autonomy, feeling respected and being in an environment of respect and inclusion, flexibility in multiple dimensions, and being in a workplace where they feel they have an opportunity to teach and to learn, and a non sort of backed into a hierarchical corner workplace where there's sort of flexibility within. Well, when you look at the research about what emerged in people's minds during COVID as they sat with themselves and the jobs from which they were laid off or the jobs that they were doing in such a different way and so on, many of those same characteristics emerged. So we have kind of a moment here where we could, as employers and workers, collaborate to double down on making work more meaningful for the talent we're trying to attract into the workplace. I'm not saying we're going to do it. I'm saying we could.
So Ruth, just kind of building off of that, we did this survey that found that 83% of global executives, they value a multi-generational workforce, right? But yet when you looked at whether or not they include age as part of their DEI policies, 53% didn't. And I think the Harvard Business Review has even done some work looking at age-diverse workforce. And they said that, from a culture perspective, leaders want to foster that. But from a practical execution standpoint, they don't know how. So I guess my question for you, Ruth, and then for you, Jacqueline, is how can we help employers understand the different talents and gifts that comes with the different generations? How can we help them understand how to leverage that in a way that addresses and ensures that the organization is more productive, that they're actually retaining top talent, that the bottom line is increasing, and that there's greater information sharing? So would love to get your thoughts on how can we, given the gap between what employers say they value relative to what is actually being executed, how can we address that and provide some insights?
Yeah. See, here I start to get a little contrarian with your analysis, because I think that saying I value a multi-generational workforce is much like saying I love my mother. It's such there's so clearly a right answer to that question. Like, who says, no, I don't want a diverse, Everybody knows the answer to that. What we have to be clear-eyed about is that in addition to there being these opportunities, there are also deep baked in stereotypes about aging. Ageism is, I'm sure you've heard this 5 zillion times already in your day and a half, but it remains a widely socially acceptable prejudice. There are other prejudices that we are alleged to have eliminated. I would say not so much. But this one, it's fine to be on birthday cards. It's fine to be in advertisements. And it's in ourselves. So first and foremost, we believe this ageism. Read Becca Levy's book. It's very approachable. It's all exactly about how we embody aging stereotyping. And so the first thing that happens is we start to be less assertive, less sure of ourselves, more questioning, more self-doubting, and then they smell blood in the water, right? It's weakness. And we don't stand up for discrimination when we see it. We don't file those claims. When we do file those claims, they aren't investigated. When they are investigated, they're not found. I mean, less than 10% of age discrimination claims are settled in favor of the claimant, and most of them are just dismissed. So, and half of workers over 50 will experience an involuntary layoff at some point in their work life. They will then be unemployed for a long period of time and go back to work at a lower level of pay. This finding has been reproduced now by 3 different groups of economists doing 3 different kinds of data analysis. I saw Peter Goslin talk to you yesterday. Did he talk at all about this, or did he just talk about IBM? But he and Rich Johnson at Urban did the first of these analyses, but it's then been replicated over and over again. So that says, and what are those involuntary retirements? They're comprised of being pushed out, age discrimination, plus plant closings, layoffs, caregiving responsibilities, and the person's health. So they're not all the employer did it, but they're also not all the employee did it. So we need to hold several competing realities in our hands when we set the problem out in front of us.
Well, I like the question, and I can't say I don't like the question because you're the moderator, and that would be weird.
And I already said.
I want to make sure, so I moved this back so that way our colleagues over here can also get some love and attention.
Well, I do believe that institutions and organizations clearly have a role here. Like, they have to have a role in this fight, if you will. When I think about the role that we all as individuals have, and any individual across the world, I think about leadership in 4 levels. We are self-leaders, we lead others, we lead communities, and we lead movements. And so many organizations, institutions start to shift because the people lead a movement. The people start to recognize, there is value in intergenerational workforce practices. There is value in us really making sure that, regardless if you're 17 or you're 77, you have value in this workplace. When that movement comes from people, then institutions start to move. And so, yes, I believe that this institution, which clearly is at the forefront of this work, has a role in it. I tend to believe that this movement and this work moves faster when the humans are behind it, when the individuals at the self level are like, hey, we have to do something about this. And so I couldn't help but thinking about when Ruth was just talking about some of the data behind it, and because of my previous work and commitment in the innovation space, I can't help but think about just this fact alone, the fact that 60% of entrepreneurs are actually over the age of 50. We tend to think that, all the innovation and all the new cutting edge stuff is coming from the 17-year-old, the 20-year-old, the 30-year-old, the millennial, when in fact there's a lot of wisdom at the top, right? Because the mistakes have been made. When I say we, the mistakes have been made a lot of times and things have been learned from it. I think that it is an individual fight, meaning that at the self level, we have to show outside of institutions that we care about this so that institutions then begin to move. So I believe that organizations have a role, Jean, but I think we move a lot faster if we're really fighting it at a self level and more at a community level, and movement level.
So just building off of that, and I love the point about pushing out, in part because now the new term is quiet firing.
Quiet quitting.
There's quiet quitting, and then there's also the quiet firing. So the quiet firing is when you're actually, the emails stop. The invitations to meetings stop, and and all of that. But on that note, either at a personal level and from the interactions that you've done in the business world and interactions from research, are there tangible examples of how to create that culture of empathy, that culture of caring, that culture of, hey, I want to learn from you because you have a different perspective? Like, how do we create that culture?
A couple ways. I'll say this. I have hesitations with making the next statement I'm going to make because I know this word that I'm going to throw out here, it makes the hair on the back of their neck stand up. And I know that some people will love me making this statement, but I'm just going to say the statement already, right? I started the company that I operate now, Scarlet, which is a leadership consultancy, as an etiquette firm, okay? Stay with me here, all right? I know a lot of people feel certain ways about the word etiquette because it can be generalizing, it can be dismissive if it is used in an incorrect way, right? At the end of the day, the definition of etiquette is the accepted code of behavior for particular situations. As someone who's originally from Detroit, who really, it makes no sense that I'm here for lots of different reasons in my life, etiquette allows us to see what the rules are and to be able to navigate in particular spaces, right? There are 7.7 billion people in the world. So it is impossible for me to do things just my way and expect that it's gonna jive with Jean, it's gonna jive with Ruth, it's gonna jive with Jacqueline and Lori and Laura. Like, we have to have some common ground. And when we at a basic level really pour into and align around the fact that, oh, if I at my individual level buy into these accepted codes of behavior, I get further. Why? Because I can't get where I want to get in my career or personally on my own. I just can't. And so I do believe that when we buy into this common, like our common rules, our common protocol, our common practices, we get further for it. I will say too, Jean, I have this deep love for a relationship between grandfather and grandchild, particularly grandfather and granddaughter, right? It's just this magic that happens with, anybody know, like the magic with your grandfather is just immeasurable. But for some reason, we forget about that magic and that wisdom when we step in the front door of our workplace, right? That wisdom generationally, that you can't get those learnings from anywhere else except from that person who's been through it. Well, take that magic and that energy into the workplace. No, you're not connected by blood with this person, but they've been through some stuff and they can teach you some stuff. And so just like I believe that your leadership skills permeate and you had the opportunity to become a stronger leader by recognizing how you're practicing leadership skills outside the workplace to bring them inside, I say bring that same energy about respecting other generations into your workplace as well.
Wow. Ruth?
And I think that organizations can set cultures that are conducive to this kind of growth or suppressive of it. One of the characteristics of workplaces that work for people of all ages is a concept that I've been thinking about as radical flexibility. So this is more than Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we're in the office, and Monday and Wednesday, we're at home. And radical flexibility is, what if I did more than pay lip service to that phrase, workers are our greatest asset, and instead conceptualized each worker as my greatest asset? Then when they came in, when I met them, instead of saying, well, this is when the job is, you have to work Tuesday, Thursday from 3 to 7, I would say, when is it good for you to work? And conversely, when can you never work? When is it impossible for you to work? Now, when I first say this, employers go, the schedule, the complexity. You have an algorithm, a just-in-time algorithm in the retail workplace that allows you to schedule your workers so nobody works more than 38 hours a week, and then you'd have to slip up and pay them benefits. So you can program that same algorithm with each person's needs and preferences, and you would have talent that is not currently available. If you had the parent, the grandparent, the sibling, the good neighbor who at 3 o'clock every day had to do school pickup. And so they couldn't work past 2:30. But oh yeah, over here, there's all my college students. And they are done classes by about 3. But so they need a job that starts at 3:30. Well, look at that. You can put those together, right? Not by hand. Your computer's going to do it. And radical flexibility has multiple dimensions and leads to multiple opportunities for exchange and deepening that is it's just not possible when we've made the pattern and we're expecting people to fit in to the pattern we've made.
Wow.
Jean, can I?
By all
really-
means, you guys have taken over. I'm just taking notes.
There's an addendum I have to add on to my previous answer, because I think it is the problem that we get into when we talk about intergenerational workforce. I clearly made the statement and provided you the visual of how a worker, presumably a younger worker, might respect someone who is an older worker in the workplace. I gave the analogy around grandfather, granddaughter, or grandchild. And what I didn't do, what I failed to do in that moment was to talk about how a worker who maybe has been in the workforce for 40 or 50 years may also see value from a younger worker as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that often is what's missed, right? Is let's make sure we respect tradition and respect wisdom and respect growth at an organization or somebody who's been there for 30 or 40 or 50 years or in the workforce for 30 or 40 or 50 years. And I think where the connection happens here with the data that Jean showed before, why people are leaving the workforce because they don't see value, is that it isn't seen the other way around. And oh, there is a worker who is Gen Z or who is a millennial who also has value and ideas and interests. What might I learn from them as well?
Mm-hmm.
Just to create this will and this process of value, and I value you, you value me, independent of where we fall on the age spectrum. And so I just made the error just that quickly as someone who's had a relationship with AARP, who's sitting here on this panel invited at AARP, just that quickly. I forgot in that moment to make that connection. And I think that happens a lot. And so I think we have an opportunity to have this reciprocal wheel of value, right? Where people feel value independent of if you're 17 or you're 77.
Wow.
And there's some interesting case studies actually in journalism, in your field, of older and younger journalists in mentorship, reverse mentorship positions. There's a beautiful write-up in the Times of investigative reporter. A younger journalist said, you know, take me under your wing, show me how to do what you do. And that reporter said, if you show me how you're posting on social media and turning these things into visuals so immediately, and then together they wrote about that experience. And you have those kinds of bonds that happen sort of organically between people, but then institutions can set structures that help to build them. I don't think you can, I think matchmaking is kind of hard to do. So I don't know that you can assign someone the person that they're going to click with, but you can certainly set up a framework where you hope that people have, or make it possible for people to have a relationship with somebody other than their immediate team members and their immediate supervisor to help sort of problem solve together, learn the ropes, teach the ropes.
So I'm going to pivot the questions real quick, and then I want to open it up to all of you. to ask any questions that you may have, particularly for our guests. And Rachel, you just keep me on task.
I will.
Thank you. You mentioned this, and that is the issue of inequity. That so much of where you sit is a function of some of the circumstances in which you have to operate.
Mm-hmm.
And that in some cases, individuals may have the option or the choice, and in some cases, they may not. So can you speak to the issue of inequity, and particularly how does this show up in the work that we do? And how do we become more intentional about addressing these issues of inequity in order to ensure that people can, whether you are a Gen Z or a millennial? Folks never remember the Gen Xers. I'm a Gen Xer, by the way. No one ever talks about it. But that's for another topic. You know, I just need the chair and a therapist. That's for another topic. But can you talk about the issue of inequity? And how do we start to intentionally solve for this within a business or an organizational context?
Yeah. So we have extreme occupational segregation in this country. There are jobs that are women's jobs and jobs that are men's jobs. There are jobs for women who are Black and brown. There are jobs for men who are Black and brown. These jobs sort by skill level. They sort by educational requirement, and they sort by opportunity for advancement. And it goes without saying, so I'll say it anyway. They sort by wages and benefits.
Mm.
When you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics list of the occupations in which there will be the most openings in the next decade, the top is home health aides and personal care workers. It's the top. If I combine those two, they have the same work arrangements, so I'm combining them. The one after that is cooks. The one after that is data software, male, upper wage, those other two, female, very low wage. Then we've had cooks. Then we get fast food after that, which I thought was good, acknowledging they don't actually cook it. It's just microwaved, but it's, you know, we all know that's a terrible job. And then we get waiters and waitresses. So in other words, we've got service and caring occupations. The first time we get a good woman's job is down at the number 7 slot with RNs, right? And we're still in the health sector, but we're now in a job. So inequities, they're not just kind of random and scattered about, and some people have good luck and some people have bad luck. These are patterned inequities across the life course. And what my center studies is how the way you age depends on the opportunities of your life. This idea of cumulative disadvantage, that if you're born with the wrong metal spoon in your mouth, things are going to get progressively more difficult on average for you. It certainly doesn't mean that each of us as individuals follow some predestined course. That's not at all what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that people's occupational opportunities follow from their situations of birth, their educational opportunities, and the opportunities across their lives. And that means we can't fix them up there at the end of their work lives. We have to be making investments across the life course. What that means in practical terms is the single most important investment we can be making is to improve the quality of education available to everybody in this country, no matter where they were born, no matter when they were born. And if they didn't get it in their first batch of education, to make it available in their second batch and their third batch, because that's the single best predictor of the other stuff that's going to happen in their lives.
I think as an additive to education, we all have the opportunity, and hopefully institutions follow suit, in arming people with the tools, the resources, and the training to check our biases, to be willing to listen, and to apologize when it's necessary. I think so often we get caught up in, I want to be right, I want to be right, even when it's not in the best interest of ourselves or what we're headed towards. And once again, I have to go back to when we, as individuals, collectively focus on the biases, the listening, being able to apologize, institutions start to follow suit when we're strong enough, and we stay really adamant with that. But I have to say that above my recommendations, quite frankly, I do believe, and I have to double click on the fact that education is a game changer. And when I say education, don't get it confused in thinking that that is us necessarily sending people to 4-year or 2-year institutions. It is the opportunity to learn, like, to get to acquire new skills. I have a lot of thoughts about 4-year and 2-year institutions, which we can talk about when we talk about Jean's issue with Gen Xing. But I do believe education and learning is critical.
So we're going to open it up to all of you. And we want to hear your questions, your insights, your comments. And I noticed that we have a great representation of different industries and sectors here. So I'm going to turn it back to Rachel. You want to?
First of all, let me apologize for mispronouncing your name, Jean. But also, I wanted to ask you very quickly before we get a question in. You were very instrumental in helping create the Age Boom Academy at Columbia. Is that correct?
Yeah.
I want you to just put in the back of your mind towards the end to give us your perspective on how this coverage has changed, what you've seen in journalism through the years. But
We don't usually promote the competitor,
Ruth, can I ask you? We'll let you do that at the end. We'll wrap up at the end.
Okay.
So we're going to start here and then we'll go here.
Okay.
So thanks for this. Ruth, at the outset, you had said that you think that we're at a moment, kind of an inflection point, where we could really make work more meaningful for everybody, but particularly for older workers. And I love that example you gave us about out of journalism with the mentoring that work both ways. My question is, this moment that we are in right now is also a moment of, remote work. And this could be a permanent thing for us. My organization has us going in twice a week. Many of my colleagues have yet to go in at all, So how does that throw a wrench in the works, so to speak, along the lines of trying to make things better for older workers if they're not going to be, engaging with each other?
Okay. So first of all, it's between 2/3 and 3/4 of the workforce who never went remote. So it's 1/4 of us to 1/3 of us who went remote. But from everything you read, everything you write, everything you see, it's remote work. Well, why would that be? Well, the people who read and write and see are working remotely. And so we're creating that narrative. So first of all, I just need to say that this moment is right there in the store, in the hospital, in the warehouse, in the UPS truck, in a post office, in the train conductor's car and has been all along, and it's still a moment. But in terms of how can workplaces take advantage of this moment, I believe that we need to allow ourselves to be more vulnerable all the way around, including as employers. I run a research center. I'm an employer. And I have a different kind of conversation now with my staff about how are we going to do things in this upcoming quarter. So we set our what's our work from home office pattern, which we then have flexibility with, but the pattern, we revisit it every quarter collectively and come up with a consensus that works for us all. That's just sort of one dimension. And I believe that we can think about changing the relationship between bosses and workers in meaningful ways. And it's overdone. Remember, this was a conversation going on when we're talking about the win-win-win. We're talking about social bottom line data. All that was going on before COVID. It just took on a new context with COVID.
If I could just add a couple of things to that, I think in addition to what Ruth mentioned, this is also an opportunity for us to think about who wins and who loses in these type of environments. And as employers, how do we ensure that we're not perpetuating inequities as a result of whether it's a hybrid arrangement, fully remote arrangement, or there's been some studies that's demonstrated that for certain populations, older adults, women, people of color, that oftentimes the opportunity to get those key projects, those key initiatives, requires some in-person connection. So thinking about how all of this kind of plays itself, even in this arrangement, is going to be important.
Can I just add one more thing quickly, Laura? I want to hear your question. Just one thing I want to add is employers have an opportunity to remember the institutions that no longer exist. We need to remember Sears. We need to remember Kodak. We need to remember Blockbuster. Because what happens is when these shifts in the world start to happen and we start to triage things in the same way that we used to, we sometimes become irrelevant, right? So a lot of institutions, as we think about the moment and what we have the opportunity to do, we have the opportunity to take action by remembering. We could say, you know what, we're going to continue doing things like this because we always did things like this. And boy, would Blockbuster love to go back and do things a little bit different. Boy, would Sears and Kodak love it. Mm-hmm. I think, institutions have the opportunity to embrace what is inevitable, and that is change. And when we start to force what happened or what the solutions were that we were using last decade for this current decade, organizations set themselves up for demise. And so I think the moment is accepting change and doing something about the change that's in front of us right now.
Yes, hi. I'm with Industry Week, and we're focused on manufacturing, business side manufacturing, and I'm just thinking a lot and wondering if you have any advice for, we cover, they have a big labor shortage in manufacturing, and there are middle skilled jobs that pay well, and we tend to focus on the younger, like how to attract younger workers to manufacturing, but I'm wondering how I can better cover age discrimination and longevity in manufacturing.
So for years, I ran an award called the Age Smart Employer, which was for employers who had policies and practices that made work for employees of all ages. And a shocking number of our winners were manufacturing companies. And so I can speak quite specifically about some tactics and strategies. First is to pay attention to your competitors who are closing and recruit from their workforces. It's really simple. These workers are going to be older, but they're going to really know the business. They're going to really want a job. And they even come in teams. It's such simple thing to do. It's one of the Brooks Brothers factory, that there was a great big piece in the Wall Street Journal about this factory, which happened to be in Long Island City and have the most beautiful light in the world. So I think they ran the piece because the art was so good. But anyway, they had every one of these strategies, including just sopping up the workers from their competitors. Your retirees, recruit from your retirees. They don't need training. They know your system. Be open to non-full-time employment. What many older workers, particularly in positions that require sitting, standing, walking, moving, physical work, people prefer to work partial days rather than full days, and you need to not have such rigidity in your scheduling to prevent that. Ergonomic design that is designed by the individual worker. So at that plant, one of the things that they did was they brought the chairs and light guy in to meet with the workers on the line, and people could pick their own, which is like, well, we don't do that at my university. It's like so stupid. Why can't I pick my own office chair? Why can't I pick my own keyboard? But think about that. And that's not just about older workers. That's about workers of every age. They had a benefit that was, you had a certain number of hours a month where you didn't have to come. You could, with no notice, just not show. And they had, everybody was double trained so that the line didn't stop when you didn't come. And so that's when all of a sudden that morning, your daughter calls, the kids are sick, you have to take care of them. You can do that day till better care is arranged, without jeopardizing your job. So those are just a few examples. There's a plumbing company that sends an older and younger plumber out together because the young guy doesn't know what he's doing, but he can fit behind the toilet. And so the older guy tells him what to do when he gets back there. And between them, they're really effective.
I am never going to forget that.
Sorry. Yeah, well, you can embellish that image and keep right on going with it if you want to, or you can stop.
We are running out of time, but we're going to take at least one more question from Karen.
Question about the educational component, because it's been coming up a lot. In 1970, as you know, Paulo Freire wrote, his book on the pedagogy of the oppressed, and the notion of conscientizao, where education is taken out of the institution and into the community, which is yet to really happen. So all of this talk makes me depressed because I don't see the action. How does one transfer all this talk and this need of the inequities that come from various forms of education into action?
Community colleges.
But I mean, other than that, just breaking down the walls and not even the traditional notion of the old-fashioned notion of education.
Right.
And I think both you and Jacqueline referred to that.
Right.
So let me start. So there's a couple of things. One is that because of the changes of life expectancy, that this idea of education being a one-stop, that it only happens at one point in your life, needs to change. And it needs to change both for us as individuals, but also for companies, because of the fact that your worker of the future will require different skill sets. So it's also in the interest of the employer to understand exactly how are we invested in our workforce from an educational training standpoint.
I'm going to push back
Yeah.
for a second. Let's take it out of the workforce equation because people get the education prior to coming into the workforce.
Yeah. So I think the other thing that I was going to say as my second point actually gets into what we're seeing, particularly with major movements like 110, where you have major companies like IBM and others that are saying, you know what, we want to hire for skills and not necessarily for quote unquote credentials. And how do we actually start to embed a skills focused strategy rather than just on particular, whether or not you have a bachelor's degree or a master's degree. And I think what you're seeing, particularly with the 110th movement, is this major initiative to try to get at least 1 million, is it 1 million, African-American workers into high-performing jobs by a very short period of time. And it's looking at the ecosystem between private industry and public sector to do that. I don't know if that kind of helps, but that starts to address some of the inequities that we're actually seeing, particularly as one ages.
I have an additive here. You're shaking your head to the side. I'm like, how can we get something from up and down from you over there? No, not that. I consume leadership content from a lot of different people for a lot of different reasons. And I do love particularly the approach by John Maxwell, which most of you probably heard John Maxwell, right? And his approach, and what I do love about this notion of learning and even graduating from high school or college, is that why are we in such a rush to force people to pick a major at that component when they really, at that juncture, when they really haven't had the opportunity to go out into the world and experience like real life stuff before you say, oh, I'm going to lock in on this thing that I'm going to do for the rest of my life. Because I'm a starter personally, and because I support other people like starting and exploring different things, I would love to see an ethos and an approach to our learning journey that's not so focused on once you graduate high school, you're going to do this forever, right? Instead, like, what are the key skills? A little bit of what Jean just said. What are the key skills that can be nurtured from middle school or high school where people can take interest in these things versus saying, all right, this is hard and fast. I'm going to be an engineer forever. Because we can even see now there are some people in our lives who've been engineers for 40 or 50 years. They're just like, I'm sort of over that. Like, that's not even fulfilling to me anymore. And so how might we, at a young age, encourage this lifelong notion of learning that allows people to just be curious and to continuously pick up new skill sets along the way, instead of I'm going to go to school for 4 years and I'm going to go back and get a master's, I'm going to go get a doctorate, and then this is my body of work forever. Like, how can we encourage that? And I think that there are many ways that we could probably put our heads together and tackle it, but I think that ethos would help us to think about education a little bit differently over time.
So those are both answers that I've given to this question at different times, and they're thinking about it, looking at it from the level of the individual, the life course. But I think what you're asking about is more of a community structure and here what I think it's the bowling alone problem. It's the fact that we have fewer and fewer community social institutions that cut across ages and political orientations and identities and locations, because we've outsourced that reality to the magic box, and we are living an atomized existence in our box. You know, nothing makes me more freaked out than when I walk into a restaurant and there's 4 people sitting around a table, and I'm not talking about you've ordered from your phone. I'm talking about instead of talking as you eat and drink, everybody is doing their social media. Every once in a while, somebody will hold up the phone and take pictures of each other so then they can post that. But that's actually like my phone and your phone having dinner together. That's not the same as you and I having dinner together. And I feel like we're losing those collective engagements, many of which are educational in different ways.
I know we're on time. Just one thing I want to add. I value this, right? I value like this face to face. But I think that the opportunity that we have there with the corralling around the table with the phones is, as many of us love this, there's other people who don't love this. And it's a matter of how do we meet other generations where they're at? Because for them, for many of them, that is learning.
I know that.
You know,
It's
and
life.
yeah, and so I think that it is, number one, giving ourselves permission to let other people learn how they learn and support that journey. I know we've started a whole different conversation here, but I think this is really important because I even too, when I see that happening with my little sister, I'm like, no, you're not learning. But really, they are coding and kicking up stuff that I can't even relate to. And so it's almost like, how do you meet people where they're at to learn, to help them to learn, and that maybe is not in a way that we're used to or that we appreciate.
Okay.
On
That was
that
a
note-
68-year-old for you.
On that note, I could not have asked for a more interactive, more energetic start to our day, particularly after yesterday and the conversations that we've had. That all of the email addresses and contacts for all of our speakers this morning are on your schedule. But I'd like to take this opportunity now to thank Jean and Jacqueline and Ruth for really helping us to understand, again, that broad range of opportunities and challenges for the intergenerational workforce, and our responsibility as journalists to really communicate them properly. So thank you all so much. Let's all give them all a round of applause.